Hello and welcome back, everyone. Today we're talking orthorexia, the unhealthy obsession with health. Today we're going to talk about how self-worth shouldn't be tied to food, and food doesn't need to elicit anxiety, and the fact that the way that we eat doesn't need to alter how we live our lives. I want to help you understand orthorexia and its parts so that you can catch any of these patterns if they creep into your mind or your life, so that you can cut it off at the head and nip it in the bud. You can be healthy without rigidity, without perfectionism, without anxiety, obsession, and fear. And I hope that what you learn here today will help you better understand that. This is In Our Skin, and I'm Ashley McCann, mind-body psychotherapist and coach. With so much of the work that I do happening behind closed doors, I created this podcast to bring it out into the light, to share the knowledge and insights that I've gained in the past 15 years of my work with you. Because one thing I've learned is that navigating body image, self-image, and confidence is a serious challenge for most women and men alike. Believe me, I've struggled too, and that's why I'm here, to share all that I've learned with you and others, so that you can get out from underneath the weight of challenges with food, body image, and self-image that can destroy our confidence and keep us from living our lives fully and freely. Today, we are talking about orthorexia, a disorder akin to an eating disorder combined with an anxiety disorder that develops when there is a fixation on eating healthy and clean. Now, I'm sure many of you out there have interest in eating healthily. It is a very difficult to define and charged concept for so many of us. But I want to be clear that today, as we are talking about this, I am not villainizing eating healthily. I hope for everyone here to walk away at the end of this episode with an understanding that health is important and valuable. And the reason that we're talking about this is that a desire for health actually can go too far and become problematic, life-interfering, and decrease the quality of life for people who suffer under it. So, while you may relate to some parts of this, this is not about diagnosing yourself and your friends, but rather this podcast is here to increase understanding and knowledge and to share information that we might not have all heard, learned, or had an understanding of prior to. We're here today to talk about orthorexia and its parts because I think that this can be beneficial for all of us in examining the ways in which we are navigating our relationship with food, how we are thinking about food, how we're thinking about eating, how we're thinking about ourselves in relation to eating. The term orthorexia was coined by Dr. Stephen Bratman, whose own journey in his relationship with food led him to recognize these patterns in himself. He defined the term to be a fixation on righteous eating. And you're going to learn so much more about that here today. But what I want you to know about Dr. Bratman is that he went on to make a lot of life changes after recognizing how harmful the patterns in his own eating had become, and he was quoted to have said, "Rather than eat my sprouts alone, it would be better for me to eat pizza with my friends." And I couldn't agree more. But for someone with orthorexia, it is not as simple as making the choice to simply start eating pizza with friends. So let's take a deeper look to understand what this is all about. Orthorexia can start out well-intentioned, wanting to prioritize health, but to be health-conscious isn't to be orthorexic. Orthorexia occurs when a fear-based preoccupation with food quality and clean eating and health come at the cost of mental health and, at times, physical health. Care turns obsessive, good intention turns into rigid perfectionism, concern turns into righteousness, and a person's world shrinks around them. Relationships are often affected, and the person often becomes isolated. Orthorexia is consuming. It often feels like a part of a person's identity, and it can fly under the radar. So let's break it down. Here are some signs of orthorexia. Remember that any of these taken alone does not mean that a person has orthorexia, but we can look at them as signs and symptoms either of orthorexia or of problematic patterns in our life. Worrying about food quality anxiously. Struggling with or avoiding eating food that you haven't prepared, feeling like you can't eat it if you don't know what's in it. So this might look like not being able to eat at restaurants or other people's houses because you don't know what's in the food, or you've narrowed your eating in ways that no longer allow flexibility. It could look like feeling agitated by the idea of consuming unclean or unhealthy foods and ingredients. Physical discomfort at the consideration of eating something that doesn't feel just right. It becomes all or nothing, either all perfect ingredients or you won't eat it. For example, refusing to eat something that's cooked in a certain type of oil or never allowing processed foods. It can look like a fear of sickness or negative health effects of eating foods that are deemed unclean or unhealthy. It can look like becoming fixated on food labels, checking ingredients whenever you're considering eating food. A sign can be having to consider whether or not you'll allow yourself to eat food that you don't have control over, or obsessively researching food, being preoccupied by food, thinking and overthinking about what to eat and what not to eat, spending unusually large amounts of time planning, buying, preparing meals. Another sign could be that life is shaped around the eating and food, as opposed to life happening and meals being able to happen naturally, freely, and easily. It can look like bringing pre-made meals to events as a result of the belief that food will not meet the standards of healthy and feeling unable to eat flexibly. Eating might become restricted by the elimination of foods, maybe even whole categories of foods. It could be grains, or it could be gluten, or it could be sugar, for example. This can look like fixating on preventing or curing disease with food or clean eating. You might have fear and anxiety at the thought of eating certain foods. Often we see people become more judgmental and more critical of others eating their food choices, and they might feel more triggered by what others are consuming. Someone might notice that there is an experience of pride in response to eating, and they might find that eating in a certain way provides temporary relief for the anxiety that they experience around food choices, but know that those are also short-lived. So people will experience often a cycling where there might be fear or guilt, then pride or anxiety and fear, and then relief, but there will be a cycling. There's the experience of guilt for eating anything that is not deemed clean or healthy or good enough as foods, or a bad food. And another sign is simply that there is a bad food list. There can be a belief that you're a better person when you eat better foods, and that you're a bad person when you eat bad foods. Or there can be a sense that there is a heightened risk involved with eating certain foods and heightened anxiety in response to eating certain foods, and negative outcome related to eating foods. So again, any of these taken alone, not necessarily problematic. You might recognize a lot of these as aspects of other eating disorders, and you'll see that there is a thread of anxiety throughout, right? So very akin to anxiety disorders. For many people, there are obsessive compulsive patternings, like the preoccupation with food is turned on high. The thoughts and thinking about food are obsessive. And the thoughts and patterning around where food is bought or how food is prepared might similarly look obsessive or compulsive. So again, it's okay to care about what you're eating, and it's another thing to feel anxious, agitated, fearful, guilty, or better than everyone else for the way that you eat. It's problematic, and we're going to tease this out to understand why, because we don't want what you are consuming to be consuming you. So let's look at how a disorder like this might develop. Everyone is different, and like any other eating disorder, any form of disordered eating or anxiety, I want you to think of this on a spectrum. For some people, it's going to show up more in one way than another, and for others, it might begin somewhere or have a certain level of risk, and for another, it might look completely different. So my intention here is to give you examples so that you can understand the many ways in which these can develop and the different shapes and forms it might take. So orthorexia can develop slowly out of good intention gone awry, but often it does take more than simply caring about our health. It can come out of dieting or clean eating. So dieting and clean eating are actually the same thing. In our culture today, we are less likely to call the way we're eating a diet. That's more taboo. It's not as cool. But we will say that we are eating clean or that that's a value of ours. We now have wellness as a guise for diet culture, and it can be really confusing and also very tempting to begin to follow different recommendations of ways to eat. So again, sometimes good intention can be where this begins. That does not mean everyone is at risk of becoming orthorexic simply for trying to eat a certain way, but our risk goes up the more that we diet or subscribe to restrictive ways of eating. So I say this because the more that we restrict and the more we believe we should restrict, the harder it becomes not to restrict, to not feel badly about ourselves if we don't. If we believe that a form of restriction is good, a better way of eating, if we adopt beliefs about food as a result, it will alter our mental and emotional responses to food. So this can stem from a person becoming progressively more restrictive. Now, this could look like starting out vegetarian and then becoming vegan, or subscribing to a way of eating that is high protein, low to no grain, for example. So where food was previously neutral or positive, diets and clean eating often lead to food moralization. It means that we're appraising its value and with it, our value. Food becomes good or bad, and when we eat good foods, we are good. And when we inevitably eat a bad food, we are bad. This can lead to us feeling virtuous or shameful in our food choices. And I think we've all probably felt this before. Maybe we've joked about it. But this is the thing. It can really begin to stick. With orthorexia, this is the way of life. It can come with the belief that our worth and value are tied to the way that we eat, so it better be clean, damn it. The virtuosity of foods calls on impurity. Not to strive for this standard might be seen as lazy or unintelligent. Do you see all the appraisals and judgments that can get tied into this, into the way that we eat or don't eat? To choose not to strive would make someone feel less than once they start striving, or they are inundated with messages about the right way of doing things. And so we're going to tease some of this out today. People do not mean to slip into this kind of thinking. They simply find themselves overwhelmed by it. It can actually start out as a way of coping. So we're trying to fix or manage something. We want to feel better, to be better. Without recognizing it, sometimes this is coping with negative self-beliefs. So if I change myself, I will be free of the discomfort of the way that I feel about myself, my body, or in this world. Trying to correct or manage feelings related to beliefs like, I have no control, I am out of control, I'm not good enough, I don't belong, or believing that perfection in eating will lead to safety, security, happiness, connection, the things that we as humans want and need most. But instead, with orthorexia, the result is quite the opposite. It leads to isolation, separation, anxiety, and often, ironically, health issues. So we see people with narrow diets often having deficiencies, malnourishment, and it can do the opposite. So at that opposite end of the spectrum, we'll see toxicity because it's truly possible to get too much of a good thing. Orthorexia can present like an anxiety disorder for some. It can have strong obsessive-compulsive characteristics, and it can also resemble anorexia. So for some, it will look and feel like an anxiety disorder because it's not necessarily tied to body image or about restricting food quantity. It's about food quality. And the anxiety might not be tied to food alone, so it could extend to toxins and contaminants in any form, like skin products, cleaning products, our environment, and so on. When we look at it through the lens of disordered eating, we can see where a history of dieting, again, can set us up for increased risk. And we do see this in a way come out of other patterns of disordered eating. So someone who's trying to correct binge behavior or purge behavior, who holds shame about those experiences, might feel like they need to control or, open quote, clean up their eating. And this can increase the risk of them going in this other direction toward orthorexia. It can also come of anorexia, where the fear of foods and beliefs about right and wrong foods fuel it. And unfortunately, we do see this happen in a way for people who are in the process of recovery, who are looking for refuge from the work of recovery and the challenges that that entails, and it will feel like a safe place to be. It's a pseudo kind of false recovery. that is full of rules and patterns that we need to contend with. Because for many, with or without recognizing that they're doing it, these patterns can become a way of rationalizing restriction, using intellectualization to explain away disorder. So people don't necessarily consciously or cognizantly manipulate information to justify restriction, but intellectualization and rationalization are ways in which our mind tries to make our behavior okay or necessary. Rationalization and intellectualization will have us focus on the information that fits the way that we want to behave or what we want to believe, and it might have us ignore other facts and other information. So for some, this also may start as a drive to control. And I've said this before, but I need to say it again. Control gets a bad rap. We all want to have a sense of control, containment, autonomy. We all want to have control over our sense of safety. And for people in this category of disorder, they want to have control over their health, right? So that drive for control is a pattern that can develop when other aspects of life don't feel in control as well. So that could be something that's occurring in the present that feels out of control, or the result of a past trauma that has left someone feeling like they don't have control in their life. So they might try to control what they can, when they can, where they can. Orthorexia is often correlated with perfectionism, and perfectionism is something that we see as a risk factor. But we need to unpack perfectionism a bit to understand what that really means. Because I think a lot of us can relate to perfectionism. And I want you to understand what it really means. And if we unpack perfectionism, we see a long list of possibilities. For example, many people feel that they have to present perfectly for acceptance and belonging. Others fear failure and its consequences. Perfectionism can also come of someone feeling like they aren't good enough, and they demand perfectionism of themselves as a way to cover or correct, or so that their shortcomings won't be seen by the world. An anxious preoccupation with perfect eating and perfect health can develop in an attempt to cope and manage the belief that they have to be perfect. Orthorexia is often equated with OCD because the fear of not following the rules, of not eating clean, of not being perfect, creates a self-generating cycle. The fear keeps people stuck in the cycle of patterns because following the rules of orthorexia strengthens and reinforces them in our brain, in our body, in our belief system. And that makes it harder not to follow them later. The anxious belief that something bad will happen if we don't follow the rules keeps people stuck. So we're trying to avoid that negative consequence. It's self-perpetuating. Let me break this one down more concretely. Let's say that there's a belief that eating a banana is bad for your health, especially a non-organic one. When a person is presented with said banana, they will experience heightened anxiety and they'll likely go into patterned obsessive thinking, a repetitive thought stream about what's wrong with the banana, the health impacts, or there might be a sinking feeling that something horrible will happen if they eat it. And now they might have a clear thought about what that negative outcome would be, or a belief about what will happen. Or they might not have a conscious thought and they might just feel overwhelming anxiety. But the result will be to avoid the banana like it's a threat. So they don't eat the banana. And then their anxiety goes down. And this is the tricky thing that we see with OCD. Because we've avoided the thing, the anxiety has gone down, we experience that relief. We've just reinforced, though, that a banana is a threat in our mind and to our body. And our nervous system is now learning to remember this and to respond in this way. So the next time there's a banana on their plate at a restaurant, the whole thing happens again and again and again. And the distress that the banana triggers is likely to grow. So the pattern is also likely to intensify. And this is likely to continue until the person actually eats a banana and sees that there is nothing bad that happens. So my organic loving friends out there, I know you're probably like squirming, and I want you to support your organic farmers and buy the food that you love to buy. It is not about that. It's just about giving an example of intense fear that can go into an irrational territory, right? So you might not want to eat a non-organic banana. And if the fear of what would happen if you were to eat that banana was overwhelming consistently in your life, I would consider that a sign and a symptom of something problematic. If you can make food choices without overwhelming anxiety, then know that this example was not about you. Okay. So it is not about a banana. It's not about organic. And orthorexia, similarly, is not about a banana or organic versus non-organic, though that could be a component for someone or anyone. It's about so many things. What begins with perhaps mindful attention to organic versus non-organic or eating fewer processed foods might turn into all or nothing, rigid, fearful living that is not full living at all. Eating foods that others have made, going to a restaurant, walking in the aisles of the grocery store changes. It becomes different. It's highly anxiety-provoking or very narrow and rule-based, and most of the stuff stops happening. So people tend to stop going to the restaurant. They tend to stop having meals with their friends. They don't just eat something that is offered to them. They might actually be more and more isolated and retreat more and more into the patterns around food, into a life that is limited and quite absorbed in this. They stop eating what they can't control, and life gets smaller. They spend so much time fixating on ingredients, what to eat, what not to eat. Relationships change. They become critical of others, and their social lives become more limited. If they attend social events, they're likely to bring their own food. And self-worth tends to get tied to the way they eat. So despite the cliche, we are not, in fact, what we eat. If I wanted to hang out with kale, I would spend my time in a garden. I would rather be surrounded by friends who make me laugh. You know what I mean? So jokes aside, orthorexia tends to have negative impacts on relationships, and people's worlds get smaller, narrower, more controlled, lots of limitations, less flexibility, less freedom, and a lot more fear. And they may not identify with the fear. There might be an anxious compulsion to maintain life in that way, but if they can't stick to their rules, their anxiety will skyrocket. So this is when clean eating has shifted from diet or curiosity or concern for health into belief system. People can begin to over-associate, feeling like it's their identity and it's who they are. And unfortunately, it's often reinforced with other people commenting on or commending or recognizing food choices. So it can make it really hard for people to come out of this because it starts to feel like who they are and the way they live and how they're seen. Social media can also contribute and is actually a risk factor. There's some research out there that's been looking at social media, and they've found that Instagram especially had higher correlations with orthorexia. So let's look at why that might be. And we're just positing here because, so let's posit here that I think you and I both know what it's like. If you're talking about something near your phone or you're searching for something, all of a sudden your feed is full of it. And now imagine that you have a burgeoning health obsession. What we look for finds us on social media. And this can really skew our experience day to day very easily. Social media gives us a sort of tunnel vision. So if we're already becoming preoccupied with our food choices and health, and now our feed is reflecting and filled with that, it is going to double down on a problematic pattern. As I said earlier, wellness is just the guise of diet culture, and it's very easy to find feeds out there that are telling us how to live right, how to eat right, and they are not necessarily professionals, and they might even be professionals. The more that we hear people prophesizing unchecked on the socials, the harder it can become to practice discernment, because all too often people on there are speaking as if in facts when actually it's their opinion or their experience. We might even hear people sharing about research, but we have to tread with caution there too. There could be research that is showing the opposite, that we simply haven't been shown or seen. The study could have been done with 10 middle-aged white males as opposed to a large, diverse population, or one that's more representative of you. So even when I'm sharing research, I want you to practice discernment. It's really important. Another problem with all of this is that we are also probably not seeing those opposing views and opposing information. Instead, we're going to see often a lot more of the same. We'll keep seeing the same messages about how to eat, what to eat, what not to eat. And those messages are going to eventually get in. The more we're consuming something, the more we see it, the more likely it is that it's going to be remembered, that it's going to stick. And then there's this other thing about social media and marketing, the know, like, trust factor. So the goal of successful influencer marketing is to let you get to know them, to give you reason to like them. And what comes next is inherently assumed to be trust. And this happens. It does work. And I guess just ask yourself, do you trust the people who you're following? I think for most of us, it's sure, yeah. Once we see enough of their content and we like enough of what we see, I think we are quite likely to listen to people. And I hope that, again, we are practicing discernment in that, but just know that it makes sense if messages get in, if we begin to accept what people are telling us as facts or the way. And there's also that layer of looking at someone else living a life like you want to live. And we know this, and yet I think we are still so vulnerable to it that we are only seeing what people are choosing to show us, right? But when they're showing us something that we would like to experience, it's highly intoxicating, wouldn't you say? So yes, social media can play into it, especially if it's a place that we are going to get our information. Taking health advice from social media is majorly problematic, and it's so damn tempting, and I know that. We all want shortcuts. We want tricks to health and happiness. And it's so easy to find people out there telling us what to do. So if I were to choose, I would say that we all just start to follow animal accounts, up with chickens and down with unchecked nutritionists who are not registered dietitians. And what can we do to decrease risk? And so beyond following chickens, what can we do to decrease risk? To manage the messages that we're inundated with about right and wrong and good and bad, and to notice our own patterns in our thinking and our ways of eating so that we can protect ourselves and our kids and our way of living. First, we practice that discernment. We pause when we are receiving information before we accept it and put it into practice. I beg you not to take health advice from the internet or from social media, to develop a trusting relationship with a provider, a dietitian, a doctor, a therapist if you need help navigating challenges and getting clear on information. So here are some other things that we can do or keep in mind. Remember that it is okay to care. Better yet, it is amazing. Be mindful. Mindfulness means paying attention, noticing how we feel in response to foods, noticing when we're hungry and allowing ourselves to eat. And allowing ourselves to eat what is available, what is accessible, what is affordable. Are you allowing yourself to eat what is enjoyable? It's okay to have pleasure in food. That doesn't mean that we have to live solely on the foods that are high pleasure. We can also take into account basic nutrition, making sure that we're getting all the food groups, that we have variety. Again, we don't need to have a full-blown diagnosis to be concerned to make change. It's beautiful if you can start to catch these things early on so that they don't take root and so they don't grow. As I said earlier, the more we restrict and follow diets, the more likely we are to continue to restrict and follow diets. And that sets us up for a higher risk of that becoming problematic. And what does problematic mean? Problematic means that we start having more anxiety, we start becoming more fixated on foods, thoughts about food, what we're going to eat, what we're not going to eat, food rules, good foods, bad foods, and we stop being able to be as present in our life. We stop having ease going to dinner with our friends and our family. We stop having ease around having food. So watching for any of these aspects of orthorexia, as well as any other aspects of eating disorders and disordered eating, is so valuable. The research right now is showing us that about 65% of women, 65%, have a disordered relationship with food. 65%. So you're not alone if you see some of yourself in this, and it's definitely worth taking a look at. Again, it is okay to prioritize your health. Let's just not let health get in the way of living with ease, happiness, joy, presence, and fulfillment. both can coexist. Eating mindfully doesn't mean eating perfectly, and there really is no perfect way to eat. Sometimes leaning toward what we believe is perfect is what will take us into orthorexia. So allowing ourselves to be flexible in what we eat. That flexibility allows us to eat what's available and accessible as opposed to missing a meal. It allows us to eat with other people and eat in the places we are in and have experiences and also to have pleasure mindfully, right? We can mindfully choose to eat anything now and to eat something completely different later. Part of this process of healing our relationship with food means looking at the variety of foods that we're allowing in and the ways that we feel about foods and ourselves when we eat them. If you're noticing that any of the things that we've talked about today feel problematic for you or are present for you and you're curious, I highly recommend getting off of the internet and connecting with a specialist. You can connect with a therapist to talk about the anxiety or the compulsions or obsessions around food and thinking. You could connect with a dietitian to understand nutrition and health in a new way that comes from a trained professional. And I highly recommend that you connect yourself with an eating disorder trained dietitian if you do so. Even if you do not have a diagnosable eating disorder, that professional is going to help you navigate diet culture and wellness and all of this messaging through the lens of prevention. That means that they will have an approach that is going to be preventative. And by accessing support, what we're doing is maintenance, prevention. We're allowing ourselves to learn and grow, to build better awareness and self-understanding so that these things don't take root, grow, and start to interfere. Because when our relationship with food becomes problematic, it's problematic because it means that we become more fixated and consumed by thoughts about food. Good, bad, right, wrong, what to eat, what not to eat, where we can eat, what we cannot eat, and it starts to take up mental real estate. With that comes a change in our mood and our behavior, and it starts to shift the way we show up in our world. It's harder to be present. It's harder to think about the things that we really truly do value. If your relationship with food is leading to stress and distress, it can be doing more harm than the good you are trying to accomplish. It can begin to do more harm than the good that you're trying to accomplish. Chronic anxiety, chronic stress, they impact just about every system in our bodies, putting physical stress on the nervous system, cardiovascular, digestive, immune, and respiratory systems. But the good news is that we can change our relationship with food. We can prevent our relationship with food from becoming problematic, from putting stress on our minds and our bodies. We don't have to live in a cycle of anxiety around the food that we are eating. And we don't have to wait until it is interfering with our life and our functioning to start to address it. If anything that we have talked about today feels problematic or challenging for you, that's enough. Trust your intuitive sense and reach out, get some support, get connected, and begin to find the change that you really want for yourself in your life so that you can live more freely. Thank you so much for being here as always. This has been another episode of In Our Skin. Thank you so much for listening along. Remember to take a moment to follow along or subscribe, and if you can, leave a review. It helps other people connect to this free resource. If you are looking to begin to change your relationship with food, check out the link in the show notes to get connected to my program so that you can begin today. And until next time, take care.